And he slots it home. And the Tigers get the lead they were looking for. It's 1-0 Trinity.
Can you hear me? Can you please take your seats because we're ready to begin this afternoon program. So Dr. Burke has asked that I introduce our next speaker. Admiral Len Herring received an award from the President for his ability to save energy. He came all the way from San Diego to talk to our group here, and so I'd like to invite Admiral Herring to the podium, and he'll give us a talk on climate change and energy.
Great. So I normally don't like to stand behind a podium, but let me tell you what a privilege it is to be here. Oh, good. I hate to be. The preacher will stand here. Great, that's much better. Okay, so let me first say what a privilege it is to be here. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity. I'm even more thrilled because of what is here, and it's really about interfaith, and so I'm not going to be at all falling apart. At all reluctant on mentioning my faith and the importance of bringing faith into the conversation. A little bit about myself. As you heard, I'm a retired Rear Admiral. I spent 32 years in the Navy. And joined the Navy in a period of time in which the country was having its difficulty post-Vietnam. Drafted when I was younger, sought deferment through college, and ended up eventually taking a commission through an ROTC program. I sought deferment only to find solution. Thought I'd only do about 4 years and ended up being 32 and a little over 32 and a half years, and got an opportunity to do exactly what I expected, and that was see the world. So I come to this at a little different angle than some. One, I'm a warfighter by trade. I'm a surface warfare officer and spent most of my life at sea doing the bidding of the country in the surface community. When I was a little bit older, I was assigned to shore because I have a business degree. In order to make progress in supporting the shore infrastructure so that those monies could be utilized in fighting the war in the early 90s. But in that time frame, I found myself dealing more and more in the environment and how we could be better stewards of our environment. And Just again, a little bit about my background. I'm a meteorologist and oceanographer by degree, a climatologist by study. So I understand the physics and the science associated with what most of this is talking about. I've seen a tremendous portion of the world, so I bring a different scope into the process of the discussion around what climate change and the geopolitical impacts of what that represents for our future generations. And the other thing is I hold a master's degree from the Naval War College in International Relations and Strategic Studies, and a business degree from Salvador Regina University. So it brings to a little bit different perspective. I want to start with a short little video. And that short video is the piece by Morgan Freeman that was used in the first climate conference because I think it brings in one 3-minute, two minute, 38-second clip what it is that we're really trying to figure out in this conversation, in this process. Because it's not particular to us. It's particular to us as a species. That's a completely different conversation than what most individuals have when they sit down and talk about this particular problem. So can you give me that first video?
We start by deciding that beyond our doubts and differences, such a day truly exists. And that is something each of us can do today. We can make today the day we stop thinking that the changes required to get there are impossible and beyond us, and start realizing that they are not only possible, but what the future requires of us. We must stop turning from the warnings of science and fear and denial, and instead turn toward the solutions and partnerships we need. We can make today the day we stop pointing at each other in blame, and instead chart a new course together. We have never faced a crisis this big, but we have never had a better opportunity to solve it. We have everything we need to wake up to a different kind of world. We need our leaders to be brave and their choices to be bold. They will either remember us as the generation that destroyed its home, or the one that finally came to respect it. We have every reason in the world to act. We can't wait until tomorrow. This is our only home. You can choose today to make a world a difference.
Okay, any questions? We're done. So what I want to launch into now is a little bit different conversation, and I have over the course of the last couple of years begun to call it having an adult conversation. Because many of the things that we talk about on a daily basis are really not representative of how an adult looks at the future. And more importantly, how real adults address problems within their lives, or the problems that they have to face in order to make sure that the realities and the risks that they are to face are in fact addressed properly. But more importantly, measures are put in place to ensure that after me, the person behind me is not cleaning up my mess, but lives in an environment and a situation where they are better off for my efforts, not because of them. And there's a huge difference in how we are now conversing over this particular subject. And I'm bringing it to you from a different perspective. Again, I'm a warfighter. I joined the Navy to see the world, and I have. 63 different countries, 154 different ports. I have stepped on virtually every continent and been in many places in which I hope never to ever have to return. And in situations in which the t-shirt only marks one part of the memory. But I truly do understand how the rest of the world lives. And for 95.5% of you, you haven't a clue. So the relative conversation that I want to have with you right now is to bringing you into the scope and understanding of what the rest of the world is having to go through, and why the consequences of our prosperity are having a dramatic impact on the geopolitical stability that we are to face as a course of events that are occurring on a global scale that have nothing to do with our democracy or our country as a whole. They have everything to do with us as a species, not an interfaith collection of individuals, but no joke, a species that exists on the planet. And just how important is it? Because again, here I can invoke the religion. He gave us the opportunity in the garden. He gave us two opposing thumbs and intellect. Something different than every other creature on the face of the earth. How we use that gift going forward is the real question. And in order to do that, we must understand that there are aspects that are happening on a global scale that have significant impact and will have significant impact on the courses that we choose. And I'm going to go through a few of those because in everyone's life, you have to have a purpose. And for most of my life, it was I swear and defend because that's the Constitution that I support. But you know what? Today, while I still love the democracy in which I live, my life has become more centered around the people who I have to deal or I have to admit to that I've either made the right decision or the wrong decision, and these are my 5 grandchildren. Those are the people who today I have a responsibility to. Because while what we talk about today will not have much impact on me specifically and what's left in my life, but it will have grave consequences on theirs. Because they are the generation who will yield the problems that we leave them if we are not more responsible about being an adult in having this conversation. So what does that really mean? Well, first you have to ask the question, are we really sustainable? How much of the world lives like we do? Because this is what we expect. Even when we talk about it, we talk about the prosperity and progress of the world to look like this, to eat, drink, live, cohabitate as we do. Well, let me tell you something, folks. We represent in the industrialized world just 13% of the world's population, and we control 70% of the world's resources. To have the rest of the world look like this, live like this, act like this, is not physically possible unless we change the way we utilize the resources that are this type of environment. And we have to keep things in perspective. Because the conversation often alludes to, not a problem, we've been there before. Well, you know what? And I won't bring a religion in here, but the Earth's been around between 4.5 and 5 billion years from an archaeological perspective. Okay? How long has man been on the face of the Earth? And I'm talking Homo sapien. About 260,000 is what they would say. Homo sapien erectus, roughly the first time the intelligent came together, and we have the first indication that we have intelligent being and conversation. So it's about 260,000 years. That said, if you were to put Earth's timeline in a year scale, January 1st being the Big Bang, or however the creation of Earth, and today being December 31st, how long has man been on the face of the Earth? A total of 14 seconds. 15 seconds if you want to count this new discovery of Africanus. 15, maybe close to 15 seconds. But the truth of the matter is, folks, man has had an incredible impact in that very short time frame. So when people say, we've lived through it before, no, we haven't. We are in unprecedented territory. For the last 650,000 years, the particulate matter of carbon in our atmosphere has never been above 300 parts per million. Never. And again, how long has man been on the face of the Earth? 260,000 of that. So who cares what the precipitative matter was 1.5 million years ago? Man wasn't around. Most primates weren't around. So who cares? It makes no difference in the conversation. But the last 14 seconds has a lot to do with where we go forward and how much of an impact and how fast is this changing. And what do we need to do to stop this exponential growth of particulate matter within our atmosphere? Because remember, from your chemistry, 100% is 100%. The more particulate matter that enters the atmosphere in carbon and other gases, the less oxygen. We are an oxygen-breathing species. And we have to look at virtually every part of our environment because we really do need to understand our impacts and what a drastic change has occurred over the course of the last century. One of the things on that graph that maybe most people don't understand and why people will say, you know, man's not really doing it, but did you see where the spike in that particulate matter chart started? And guess on the date? 1850. 1850 marks the introduction of the second industrial revolution. Man introduces fossil-burning engines to work. And we've known about the impacts of carbon since 1858. The Black Death of London brought about the scientists who then discovered exactly what carbon molecules were doing to the environment and forecast if we were not more careful, we could have an impact. Well, here we are, 150 years later, still saying it's junk science. But in fact, the realities of that science have proven themselves to be absolutely correct. We don't understand what we are doing to our environment as a whole because we always use ourselves as an example of why it's necessary. If you take a look at the studies that have been done in our oceans, in the last 50 years, we have fished out roughly 80% of the adult fish population of the world. And if we are not more careful, by 2050, it is estimated that the adult fish population on the globe will be gone. And not just because of fishing, because of other issues that we have to deal with. And they're really about the consequences of some of the other things that we're doing. When you look at what is the Earth's oceans and why is it so important that we understand the dynamics of this incredible planet, this gift, and not understanding as we increase our oceans are the single largest sequestration tool on the planet. And again, chemistry, math, the science, 100% is 100%. You cannot go above 100%. And the oceans have reached points of what is saturation, which we refer to as acidification, causing major damages across the globe, in which nearly 20% of our reefs, and this is a 2010, I just attended a conference in last year in North Carolina, in which the professor who had spent virtually 40 years, 50 years of her life studying global reefs, indicated to us all that by 2050, 85% of the world's coral reefs will be bleached. That means dead. Okay, it's a life species in a biome that houses 25% of marine life dead. And that doesn't even begin to encounter a conversation that we had after, where I asked her, how does sea level rise also impact on that death? Because coral grows at certain levels because they need an exchange of UV to stay alive. And they grow at levels because the seawater provides them the buffer. Well, if that seawater rises over the next 40 years to 8 to 12 feet, coral cannot reproduce themselves fast enough to stay alive. We've got to figure it out. 250,000 square miles of our ocean today are considered dead due to saturation and acidification. And that doesn't include the amount of square miles that are impacted by our pollution. This is just acidification. These areas have reached saturation. And the statistics are staggering. What's there in our oceans are amazing. And we don't understand just how big of a deal this is. More importantly, how much of a provider the ocean is for our species. In the Pacific Rim, nearly 70% of all protein content in a diet is consumed from the sea. But yet, in the next 40 years, potentially, it could be gone. We're already seeing, and we will talk about the geopolitical instability of the loss of fishing grounds throughout the Pacific that are now causing major issues of those individuals who virtually subsist from the ocean. And we got to figure it out. But our oceans have become our wastebasket. There is some 8 trillion tons, by the sweet estimate, in our oceans of garbage. The North Pacific Gyre is nearly the size of the United States. Our garbage, our waste, our contaminant, our refuse, thrown into our environment, which is having a serious impact on the animals that live in it. Check out the film Midway's Crisis. But the Pacific albatross is potentially on the bed of extinction because they're consuming our plastics and are unable to pass them once they're ingested. And they are dying by the tens of thousands. The film is amazing, but it's just one small example of how these small pieces of plastics are having a major impact on this gift. And this is, that's the mariner of the sea. That's the symbol of the mariner, the albatross. But it's everywhere. Tens of thousands of tons. Their estimated 8 billion tons are added to our oceans every year. And we're still having conversations about banning plastic products within 200 miles of the coast. Seriously, the microplastics that end up as the decomposed materials will never become part of the environment. They're a man-made product. Polys are not natural. Therefore, they become part of the food chain. They are known to be cancer-forming agents. As a matter of fact, the plastic bag in California actually has a statement on the bottom. It says, this bag is not intended for the long-term storage of food. It contains carcinogens known to be cancer-forming agents by the U.S. Health Department and the state of California. But yet we have this argument about whether or not we should ban it. Most of them, 70% of all recyclable plastics, never make it to the recycle bin. What a travesty. Having an adult conversation, changing the way we do business, there you go, there's one. Be more responsible. Because this is one of the atolls off the coast of Midway. This is roughly 60 tons of trash left after a storm. And there's no one there to clean it up. When the next storm blows by, it'll just wash it right back out. We have spent millions of dollars studying this crap, not one penny cleaning it up. And we still argue, doing environmental impact statements, as to whether or not banning this stuff is the right thing to do for our environment. And there's no one to simply blame. Everybody says, well, that's because it's all coming from China. No, it isn't. When I was the base commanding officer, I had an event the second day in which a boom stopped 60 tons of trash from the Chulas Creek area in San Diego. 60 tons. If that boom were not there, that 60 tons would have washed out into the Atlantic, and there are 2,500 outwashes in Southern California. And then we have to look at mankind and nature. We're just simply not doing a very good job. The decisions that we make far too often are towards our own prejudice. We don't bother to consider the consequences of destroying the ecosystem that recreates a balance that actually affords the opportunity for the environment to remain healthy. We don't understand what it takes to bring an environment back. Watch the movie, Yellowstone Restored. Yellowstone was on a trip to total disaster. The reintroduction of the timber wolf has in fact created a biosystem that has now restored the entire environment of northern Yellowstone. And it was by that introduction, recreating the natural hierarchy that prevented what could have been a national disaster in the environmental scale. But it's just one example of how important it is that we not displace, for reason of our own, the environment that is so important to us as a whole. And it's not just there, it's everywhere. We have to figure out that, we talked about the forests and the likes. Well, let me tell you something. We're in a big crisis. And we're in a lot bigger crisis than people want to admit. Anybody have any idea what one of the records are for last year that nobody said anything about? Unless you lived in California, because then it was a much more apparent issue. 4 times more forest was lost last year doing wildfire than the last decade. Why? Because our environment is significantly drier. And the impacts of those forests on a global scale, there were 50,000 fires in Central Africa. 50,000 fires. So we talk about man and his effect on taking away the forest, which is the 3rd largest sequestration tool on the planet. In one forest fire in California, 726,000 acres, we destroyed more forest in that 7 days than the rainforest in a year. The consequences of these actions are all part of the risk. And the sub-Saharan Africa is becoming more a desert than a Sahara. primarily because we're in the 17th and 18th year of significant drought. Plants don't live that long without water. But at the same time, you talked about human flow. We're going to talk about that in a second. And then when we start making, we talk about domain, and we had a great conversation in the side study, but he gave us dominion, so he says. But I'm 63 years old, and in my lifetime, more animals, flora, and fauna have gone extinct than the previous 1,800 years. What a steward of God's beautiful environment our generation has been. And if you didn't go to San Diego last month to see the last northern white rhino on the face of the earth, I feel sorry for you, because there isn't anymore. And they were eradicated from the face of the earth simply because they believed that the horn contains an aphrodisiac. It's no different than your thumbnail. But they have been erased from the earth. At one point in time, there were 60 million elephants. Today, there are less than 1 million. We had 30 million bison in 1850. Today, we have less than 4,000, and most of those are domesticated. And then we have to talk about the other fly in the ointment. Because even Morgan Freeman didn't want to address the real concern. Because if you noted in his piece, he said all 7.3 billion of us. Well, folks, let me throw a big turd in the pie. Because the truth is, we are in our 5th round of doubling. And this is something that no one wants to talk about, because the sensitivities around what this really means brings out emotions that nobody wants to deal with. But in the next 40 years, it is expected that our population will grow 2.4 to 2.7 billion people. And the Western cultures of the world have done a fairly decent job of controlling that population. But the rest of the world, that is not the case. And that is the portion of the world that has the least capacity to deal with the instability that this growth then constitutes on a global scale. This is the equivalent of adding in India and China to the face of the earth in the next 40 years. Everybody got that? Not in America. America times 8, 9, with the new numbers. That's what we're looking at, adding that to the face of the earth. And we want to put up a wall. Out of South Africa alone, we are dealing with 54,000 refugees a day because of the plight of water deprivation and food shortages and the fear of civil war. This is a crisis that we truly will have to face, because in it is this piece. And that is, how do we even begin to feed another India and China, recognizing that the world is already at its highest point for hunger? And I will tell you again, we define hunger totally different from the rest of the world. Poverty for us and food deprivation means something totally different. I didn't get my snack between breakfast and lunch. It's not 4 ounces of water today and a granola bar this week. Because we are the world's worst in understanding the plight associated with this. Because here in America, we throw out 40% of everything that we grow. In a study conducted, it was shown that we throw out more food every day than the entire continent of Europe consumes. And Europe was used as part of that study because those people are not starving. But we throw out more food every day than they consume. And more importantly, we pass legislation and health care plans to eliminate the opportunity to redistribute those foods in a fashion that does good. We are the most prosperous nation on the face of the earth, but yet we are still struggling with what we consider hunger. General Mills threw out 80,000 tons of processed grains and cereals in 2016. And they were the only ones that were willing to give their numbers. But do you know what the primary reason for their disposal was? Because they couldn't sell them because they had passed their sell-by date. Had nothing to do with the product. It had everything to do with a law that we passed that said a consumer needed to be informed when that particular good was no longer guaranteed by the producer to have the same quality. It didn't mean it wasn't nourishing, that it couldn't be used for nourishment. Oatmeal never goes bad, but it has a sell-by date. And let me tell you something. Americans have no clue what true poverty and hunger is. And I've been there. And nothing is more heart-wrenching to see the true sense of poverty on a global scale, where mothers are clutching their children because they no longer have sustenance to produce the milk necessary to keep them alive. There are 3.2 million climate refugees on the southern borders of the 5 African states. And the UN has no idea how to take care of them all. And it's just a beginning. You don't put a child on a boat and send them adrift in the Mediterranean because it's the fun thing to do. They're doing it because it's a plight. And they are struggling to figure out how to get there from here. There are 72,000 refugees out of the Middle East every single day. And the most of them are being literally driven from their home for a myriad of different reasons, but most of it, I gotta tell you, no longer in uniform, I can say it. Climate change and drought in Syria is the cause for the civil unrest of what's happening in that particular portion of the world. Syria is in its 18th year of drought. 3.2 million farmers have no way of feeding their families. They have moved into the towns and cities in which they have no employment, and civil war has broken out because the government has no idea how to handle it. But the consequences here are even bigger, because what Syria represents on a global scale is what we have to recognize based on this issue. One, Syria has been the breadbasket of the Middle East since the time of Christ. Today, it is the driest region on the face of the earth. It grows nothing. So what do those hundreds of millions in the region then use as subsistence? And global hunger is on the rise. What do we do as this next 40 years unfolds? Because here's the truth. In order to feed that population, man will have to produce more food in the next 40 years than he has in the past 10,000. Because from the time of man until 1850, it took that long to get from 2 to 1.5 billion. From 1850 to today, we went from 1.5 to 7.4. 150 years. This is the consequence that will destabilize many portions of the world and will cause conflict combined with this situation. And that is access to fresh water. We can go 30 days without food, but we cannot go 72 hours without water. 75% of our cell structure is water. And we need to replenish it on a daily basis. Guess what? Today, the Chinese admit that nearly 300 million Chinese do not have access to clean potable water. We have no idea how many that is in India, but if any of you have ever been to India, I can tell you the number's probably somewhere around the same. And I haven't even got a clue because the UN can't even estimate how many people in Africa don't have access to clean potable water, or for that matter, water. And there are women who get up in the dark of morning and walk 6 miles one way to carry back 5 gallons of water every single day. That is their chore before the day starts. We got to figure out how to get there from here, because the consequences of what's happening have a much greater effect on the world as a whole. And portions of our resources that provide the water necessary for sustenance are disappearing. The Imperial Valley of California sunk 10 inches in a decade. Do you know why the Imperial Valley sunk 10 inches? Because we've depleted the aquifer that holds the land up. The Phoenix Mesa has sunk 18 inches because the mesa has sunk because the water is being taken out of that aquifer and not replenished at the same capacity. And let me tell you something, folks. There is not a physical event that man will ever be able to produce that will restore the hundreds of billions of gallons lost in that the subsidence. That happened during Platonic shift. Those happened during periods when the earth was in a traumatic state. And those aquifers can never be restored. Those are the waters that my grandchildren need to exist, because only 2% of the water that falls on the face of the earth ever makes it to the aquifer. 98% of it ends up in the ocean. Amazing. And we do very little to capture it other than our reservoirs. And oh, by the way, when a reservoir is 100% fill, it's 100% fill. There's nothing more you can do. I don't care if you get 20 inches of rain. If your reservoirs are filled, that's all you're going to get. All that stuff's going to run out into the ocean, because only 2% of that will end up in the aquifer. And we're in dire straits. California's bad and getting worse. We are truly in our 18th year of drought, because it takes 3 years of normal rain conditions to replace 1 year of loss. So while we had a good year 2 years ago, it melted 4 times faster than it should have, which means the reservoirs were already filled, and that water that should have been through the summer actually ran out into the ocean. California, San Diego, where I come from, is now at 8 inches below seasonal average as of today. 8 inches below normal. And we don't get a whole lot of rain all year long. But things are really serious. If you read National Geographic last month, they have a great article about the 8 major lakes of the world that have virtually ceased to exist. One of them in the middle of Iran, where 30 million people now no longer have a place where their families grew up as fishermen, subsisted off the lake. It's gone. But this is Folsom Lake, just outside of Sacramento. In 3 years, see, 2011 is an interesting year because that was a year of elections. Nobody wanted to address the consequences of conservation and the potential. And by 2014, because nothing had been put in place, Folsom Lake went dry. And what's really important is at the end of that, is a power plant. And California lost 13% of its hydroelectric power due to drought, which has to be made up by some other source. And oh, by the way, it's not all renewable, because hydro is renewable. Therefore, we add a bigger carbon footprint to the energy needs, because we're not being a conservationist in the measure in which requires us to be adults. And it's all over the place. Alarm bells have tolled virtually everywhere. Sao Paulo, Brazil is in total crisis, and it's at the end of the rainforest. Sao Paulo, Brazil is the first major city, mega city in the world that is looking at depopulating 8.5 million people in the next 7 years. Primarily because they have no water. Because of conservation measures and water scarcity, this is the 12th largest city in the world who's run out of water. And of course, you want to talk about equality. I would tell you that the affluent in Sao Paulo are not having a problem. And then we have to come to the subject of climate and not weather. It's very, very important because far too often do I get into a conversation with individuals and they want to combine the two. They're not the same. One is the consequence of another, but climate is something that happens on a global scale over long periods of time. As a matter of fact, climatologists use decadal measurements. We do not use single-year events. As a matter of fact, we don't even use 2- and 3-year events because they're inconsequential in a century-long measurement that defines climate. And scientists agree today that the climate is changing 10 times faster than it has in the past 65 million years. Now, while all scientists don't agree in why, they do agree that climate change and global warming are in fact a reality. And again, weather is something that we will see significantly change as a course of the global warming, because the consequences of a warming air and water surface or temperature is that the veracity of the interaction between air and sea, or air and air, because weather really is the conflagration of two separate air masses colliding with one another in a global scale. That's what yesterday was. You had a high pressure ridge and a low pressure ridge banging against each other, and that's what you got. As a meteorologist, it was fascinating to watch last year. When I was a student, there would never be a doctor, and Dr. Durley became the hurricane, the head of the Miami Hurricane Center. He was my instructor. But to think that we could have 5 low pressure centers in the Atlantic at the same time, and 3 of them actually develop into Category 5 storms. If you have any idea the energy that it takes to do that, you will understand just how incredible that event is. But there were 7 other meteorological events around the globe that happened last year that have never happened in the course of our recorded history. The veracity of the storm and the increase is due primarily to global warming. For those of you who, well, you guys are in the hurricane business, the warmer the water is in the Gulf, the more possibility is that the storm increases in intensity. Well, that's exactly what's happening. And again, the ocean is absorbing a tremendous amount of that heat. Okay, so here we go. And then we have to talk about sea level rise, because it is part and parcel to the problem that we have to deal with. So many people want to look at this as an example of why sea level rise is such a big deal. This has nothing to do with sea level rise, folks. The fact that the Arctic is disappearing has everything to do with climate change and global warming, but it has very little to do with sea level rise, because the Arctic is a floating mass of water. It's already in the displacement of the Earth's water source. What is of grave consequence to the sea level rise is the glacial ice that is now being melted across the globe, or being allowed, in some cases, Greenland, for example, that sheet ice acts like a dam. When that sheet ice disappears, now the glacial ice that normally melted and then refroze is emptying into the ocean. So the higher the temperature gets, the more consequence we have to deal with regard to sea level rise. And it will have major impacts, because depending on the study, and now H++, the SWEET study, indicates that if all the glacial ice on the Earth melts, we could look at a 23-foot sea level rise, 23 feet. Now, we don't want to put extreme danger into the whole equation, but we do need to be conservative in how we address what we have to look forward to. So we can't say it's not happening, because it is. Over the course of the last decade, it's raised 8 inches, or the last half a century, it's raised 8 inches. So we do need to understand, and potentially, even if the conservative estimates are utilized, it's 17 centimeters or 33 inches. That's the minimum. But it's not the sea level rise that we have to be worried about. It's storm surge. Many of our local communities around the areas of the sea have for years dealt with the fact that when the sea rises and falls, we take into consideration what that means. Add another 13 to 23 inches to that, and the veracity of the storms that we can expect, therein lies the problem. Because the veracity of those storms will have a greater impact on those coastal communities. And, oh, by the way, 70% of the world's population lives within 200 miles of an ocean body. There is an estimated 100 million to-be sea level rise refugees by 2050. If you want to see an amazing film, go see Bangladesh. It's called 30 Million. But 30 million individuals from Bangladesh in the next 20 years are expected to be displaced from the Bangladeshi deltas because of sea level rise. And they're already losing 500,000 a year. And we'll talk about what that really means. But anybody ever been to the Philippines? Okay, so if you've been to the Philippines, you understand there are about 1,800 islands in the Philippines. The average height of an island in the Philippines is just 5 feet above sea level. Most of them are atolls, they're mangroves, they've just grown out of centuries. A 13-inch rise, conservative, and a Category 2 storm puts 12.4 million people out of their homes. And last year, there were 6 Category 3 storms that just missed the Philippine Islands. So we have to understand, God has given us all the gifts we need. As a matter of fact, we talked when we first got here about the sand or the fuel in Texas, and the now declaration that there are actually more millionaires who are wind farmers than there are oil producers in the state of Texas. And you know what's really cool? Because none of those people own that resource. God gave that to us. They're just harvesting it in a tool that we made in order to be more respectful of the gifts He's given us. In 1 square meter in Southern California, the sun produces enough energy to power a normal residence for an entire year. The problem is that we have not taken the same effort to harness that energy so that we can be more productive in how that energy can be used. We use a different form of excuse. Because if I had keys to the castle, I would create, for those of you who have been in the history world, I would create a World Manhattan Project. And that Manhattan Project would bring together all of the brilliant scientists of the world to solve this single problem. Because more than enough energy is provided to the globe on a daily basis to power the Earth for 20 years at its current rate. What we don't have is the capacity to store it, translate it, and store it for use. That's how we fix the problem. We can't keep using yesterday's solutions. And we've got to figure out how to get there from here. You know, I would tell you in the state of Texas, you got to start with state legislation. A lot of conversation, but it also helps when the state is there to provide incentives and initiatives, but also mandates municipalities to cover and collect. And there's lots of solutions at hand. We just got to figure out how to get the storage together. We got to figure out how to smartscape. And I know there's a whole bunch of terms for it, but if you live in an arid climate and you live in a desert, you got to be smart. and not cover it with grass. As a regional commander, I took out 40 acres of grass and put in turf, bio-turf, as a replacement. But I saved the taxpayer $1.3 million a year. You're welcome. For not watering it, treating it, caring for it, fertilizing it, regrowing it after a tremendously bad summer, or doing anything else. And most of it was desert. Lemoore, El Centro. We had 60 acres of literally grass in El Centro, Florida, or El Centro, California. It's in the middle of the desert. We'll get rid of it all. But we have to get how to do it. We got to figure out how to get there from here. Waste is a big problem. One, it's a producer of the gas that we're having to worry about. But two, 70% of this stuff is packaging. It's not what we use, it's what we use to get the product to you to use. We've got to figure out how to get there from here. And then the other 30% is the food we threw away. We got to figure out how to get there from here when it comes to the integrated processes associated with the renewable energies, residence, commercial, you name it. There is not a municipal building anywhere that operates from 9 to 5 during the daytime that should not be implemented with a solar project. And you don't hope that to happen. You have to make it happen. There has to be changes in the way we look at this. There is not how much sun power is here in the university? Okay, enough said. But 90% of when you look over a city, the roof structures that are available, but even better yet, the tens of thousands of acres that are taken out of a city that's a parking lot. And oh, by the way, part of our global warming is in fact reflective and absorptive energy that the sun then takes into our asphalt and then releases it at times when we can't get rid of it in the same fashion. Because those are energies that are not normally stored in Terra. They are artificially being stored by the product that we're using. So if you put a solar panel over the top of it, guess what? It disappears. And so too does the heat in your car. Wow, amazing, isn't it? And no environmental study is required because it's already impacted land. Jeez. Not that hard to get there from here. But we need to figure it out all over the place. We can't walk away from the solutions of tomorrow because it just doesn't fit into our psyche. The conversation in California over the bullet train, not in my backyard, not here, not there. My wife and I went from Paris to Amsterdam in 2 hours and 8 minutes on the bullet train. Top speed, 211 miles an hour. If we put a bullet train between San Diego and LA, we would eliminate 90 flights a day out of Lindbergh Airport. And in 2 trips, we would move as many passengers in those 2 trips as we could all day long on those 90 flights. We have to look at it differently because, again, we keep looking at the problem as if this is the static environment we're living in. We are not, folks. All of the issues that I just talked about will come to bear. If you think that you're going to keep out that 2.2 billion people, you're wrong. It has to be part of our equation. We either fix and figure out how to solve it in their backyard, or we have to figure out how to fix it and help in our backyard. And this is my last part. So Sam Locklear was a great friend of mine. Sam was the Pacific Theater commander, and he's the first person who went to the Congress and said climate change is the single greatest threat to national security, vice North Korea. And we know how to deal with North Korea. But he's the first person to actually take and evaluate the consequences of climate change in the most populated region of the world and the incidental national security issues that those consequences will have on the United States. Because we are the go-to for virtually every humanitarian. And I was the Humanitarian Relief Disaster Assistance Officer on the Joint Staff for 2 years. And I would get 3 to 6 phone calls every month. Today, I understand that same branch has 3 officers working it because they get 12 to 18 calls, in some cases, a week. They're looking at us to solve their problems, and they're everywhere. The migrant problem across the world is not all based on conflict. The migrant problem across the globe is a combination of results that have to do with the changes in environment that causes an individual to pick up and move. And what's really not understood is, once a refugee, the average life of a refugee is 26 years. 26 years. So we are not creating refugee problems that we can solve tomorrow. And again, 54,000 a day out of South Africa. If you've not seen the movie Human Flow, Dr. Wee did an absolutely superb job of breaking down the 6 aspects that face the globe today on refugee problems. He holds back nothing. And I applaud him for addressing the concerns on a global scale and addressing those aspects of political incorrectness that are needed to address how to solve the problem going forward. And if you listen to the speech by the Hungarian president this past week, you can tell that that movement in Hungary was all about national protectionism. It had nothing to do with the plight of Hungary as a whole. It had everything to do with making sure that Hungary as a whole remains isolated from the refugee problem of Europe. That's a geopolitical disaster waiting to happen. Climate change and disaster, Bangladesh, again, 500,000 individuals every year go into Dhaka, which is the most densely populated city in the world. And Bangladesh really has no government and no economy to deal with these folks. And they're causing massive problems. As a matter of fact, on the Indian border, they are given orders to shoot. They do not want. And remember, the cultural difference that created Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the true regional leftovers. Because when India and Pakistan were formed, there were cultural differences and everybody else went to Bangladesh. And that's the way they've existed for nearly a century. And now they have nothing to do and nowhere to capture. And they are major problems. This is the movie 30 Million. If you have an opportunity, I suggest you look at it. It's 28 minutes. We have to understand that, again, economies are reliant on these issues. If you saw CNN or Fox News just Friday afternoon, you saw the major Chinese military exercise that was done in the South China Sea. The Chinese have not cared one bit for the last century of the 9 islands which are now in contest. The only reason why the Chinese are now moving into that area, and I can again say it not in uniform, is because the North China Sea has virtually been fished out. And with the declaration of ownership comes to the economic zones that are recognized internationally for their ability to control the fish and the fishing industry in the South China Sea. There are major countries who will be impacted by this ultimate decision, and it will lead to conflict. It already has. The Philippines, a key threat. Again, climate change. One bad storm that hit Bermuda or the Bahamas goes through the Philippines, and we are trying to figure out how to deal with 12.4 million American protected citizens. Remember, the Philippines is still part of our greater country. And the Filipinos, the Chamorros, and the likes, they're not wanted anywhere else. There's no ability for the rest of the region to absorb this population. So we've just got to figure out how to get there. And it's not like it hasn't been talked about. We've been talking about this for the better part of 4 decades. There are significant studies by individuals who are not associated with the science community, so they are not all talking in the same thing. I actually am an advisor to the Center of Climate and Security. There are a bunch of us flag officers who are trying to alert individuals about the issues associated with what's coming. But there are tons of these. We've published a significant number of these particular reports. We have encouraged individuals to become more aware of the geopolitical and security aspects associated with it. Even if you don't want to believe in climate change, okay? If you don't want to believe that all of these other things, just the 5 factors that I talked about before I even addressed climate are all addressed in these issues and will have significant consequences on our security and our ability to maintain security in a global scale. So, academia out the wazoo has been publishing articles and papers on the instability caused by the consequences in reactive requirement of governments to have to solve problems in which are far beyond their capacities. But yet it seems to be neglected by those individuals who truly have the opportunity to make a difference, to change the way we do business. I'm going to leave you with this last bit. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in mankind's history. 60 million in uniform lost their lives. Some 110 million were casualties of consequence. In this number, only the industrialized world was involved in these conflicts. 13 countries, basically. And the principals, the Indias, the Chinas, the Indonesias, were not involved at all. As a matter of fact, they were occupied countries during these conflicts, and they constitute a very large portion of the 110 million incidentals. There were probably some 40 million Chinese killed by the Japanese in their march down the Pacific Rim. That's why they're so welcome in all of that mainland portion of the rim. But here's the piece that everybody needs to focus on. This is the consequence of developed nations in resource management. And if, in fact, the world develops in the process that we are expecting, and again, we're taking the non-industrialized world, moving them to the industrialized state at a rate 6 times faster than the industrialized world moved. They're moving from the 15th century to the 21st century virtually overnight. And the resources associated with that constitute this huge pie of the total world's resources. Now, if in fact only 13 countries battled through the 20th century for those resources, what happens when the other 65% of the world wants to move from an agrarian state to an iPad or an iPod in every pocket? What happens? And what are the sustainability measures that need to be put in place to allow that progression to occur without conflict? Because my son is completing his 18th year of service in Navy. Every single day of my son's service, this country has been at war. Okay? So my passion for this is not about my son, he'll retire in a couple years. It's about whether or not my grandchildren are going to have to serve their life, because it's going to get a lot uglier than what we have right now. And the consequences associated with that are either we make better decisions or our grandchildren will have a significantly different life to live. And we have got to understand, and while this is not a pop, but I said to John, The title of the conference is Take It Back. We don't own it. And I am in the process of writing a book, and I have been for the last couple of years, and the only piece that I truly am certain is the title. And the title is Save the Planet? What a Joke. It was here 4.7 billion years before we got here. It'll be here long after we're gone. And the consequences of what we are talking about in this room are the outcome of what potentially could be the sixth extinction. And from a faith-based perspective, I ask my pastor often, and I was corrected, Fred and I went to a conference, and it was a great opportunity, and Dr. English brought a rabbi to the group, and he said, first let me correct you, because you're not the apocalypse, because in Hebrew, apocalypse means new beginning. We, in the Christian belief, think that Revelation is the end of all ends and the beginning of something totally different. But the question is whether or not, again, did he give us the gift only to find out that it was the wrong choice, and that the species of man is not his best solution for the earth? Because again, we could be the cause of the sixth extinction. But the Lord God has given us every tool to get us to this point, and hopefully the rational behavior to move us away from this point. Thank you.
Bring the Reverend up here.
Yeah.
Keep the program going.
Okay. Good. Good. I get something to drink.
Know how you're going to do it because you don't entirely plan. And so there is a uniquely spontaneous quality to Reverend Durley. And now I want to introduce him, and he is going to provide some connection between civil rights and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting when I decided to come here today. I wondered what could I say to all of you brilliant climatologists, conservationists, environmentalists. What could I say? And I'm in a tough position right now. How do you follow an admiral who has been in the service for many years and talked about climate conditions and what it really means? And this morning I was very blessed to sit with Joe Cook, who articulated all of the virtues of climate change and all of the statistics that you just saw. I heard all of the kinds of data, statistical analysis that talked about climate change, and all of us have been in hundreds of meetings. I'm sick and tired of meetings. I have heard all of the great stories. I've watched the climate change. I've seen what's going on not only in Bangladesh, but in Chicago, Gary, Indiana, and other places right here in the United States of America. I've seen the poverty. I've heard the challenges that we face. I've seen the rising temperatures, and all of you who are here at this great conference seeking solutions, you know a lot more than I do about this. Who am I to get up and try to share something of scientific or legislative wherewithal that would excite you, that would tantalize you, that would lift you, that would even give you an ability to do what you already have to do with? But I want to thank John Burke, Trinity, for allowing me to come from Atlanta, Georgia last night. All last week I was traveling with Bernice King and William Barber and other people talking about the 50th assassination of my good friend, Dr. Martin Luther King, and how it relates to what we're doing now as we're destroying the planet and destroying each other. And I wondered, what could I say? What could I do? And Fred Krueger called me from California. He said, would you come up and share something with us in San Antonio, Texas? And I wondered, Fred, what could I talk about? Whenever you're in a dilemma to talk about something, I believe you should ask somebody. So I turned to my daughter. I said, Nia, what should I talk about? And she said, well, Dad, that's an intelligent group of people down there. Be erudite in your presentation. I turned to my son. I said, what should I talk about? And you know, young men, how they talk, they say, well, Dad, you know, just let it go on. Just say whatever you want to say. They don't care no way. They're ready to go home by the time you get up anyway. Then I asked John Burke, I said, John, what should I talk about? He said, talk about 15 minutes because we've got to take a break. But seriously, I want to talk about and share with you what I've seen from my experiences about climate change and global warming and environmental justice. My life was spent in civil rights and human rights and rights of women and rights of people who might have a different orientation. We can get locked up in so many different boxes that our silos will separate us. So why would I, a person who started in the movement 59 years ago, and as the Admiral said, yes, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's from Illinois in psychology, a doctorate in psychology. And then I went back at 40 years old and got another master's degree in divinity, and so that I could understand not only the psychological makeup of those of us who are tearing the world apart, but I can understand the power of our almighty God that holds us in his mighty hand, that asks us to make a moral decision. We're in a moral debate right now. We have the scientific data. We have all of the knowledge that has been presented, not only here, what Joe presented and what the Admiral presented. We have all of that. But how are we making moral decisions to make a difference? We see all around us. When I say somebody's a denier, I think they're a justifier. You can't deny what we see every day. So consequently, I'm challenged with that. So when I began to look at environmental justice or injustice, I began to ask the question, how does that tie with what we talked about when it comes to civil rights, human rights, and moral rights? We've got all of this information, but how do we determine to get our business people, our politicians, our educators, our scientists, all of them on a page that rests upon a faith foundation. A faith foundation that gives you the ability to believe in something greater than yourself. We can intellectualize ourselves out of a decent kind of life. But every now and then we've got to take all of the pieces and bring them together and have a foundation. What is the foundation upon which we talk about climate change? What is the foundation upon which we talk about global warming? Oh, we know the facts, we know the figures. I know about fracking in the Middle East and the earthquake in the middle of America and all of the earthquakes that are transpiring. I can quote the statistics left and right, as can you, but what do I do with it? What do I do to get me excited enough? How do I get enthused? The word enthusiasm in the Greek is entheos, meaning in God. And when you're in God, when you understand that you only have a limited amount of your finite intellectual abilities. Oh, well, let me see. Well, the Steinheim score of 27 over 19 gives us 3 parts per billion of this. We know that. But what is it that's something down inside with all of this? And as the Admiral talked about our next generation, I'm concerned about our now generation. I want some clean water. I want some fresh air. Not my grandchildren. I think we have the right, we're at a critical nexus point in our society where we begin to break down the barriers and reach over across interfaith and racial lines, gender lines, and begin to say, how do we come together? And I guess that's what this conference is really about. And since it was held on a Presbyterian campus, but Presbyterian used to be, but now it's Trinity. And all of these, I thought that that was a spiritual foundation. And I wondered, could I go back into antiquity and maybe pull out an old book, not a scientific charter, but an old book that I used to read from. Somewhere I read that there was a man that wanted to say something to a people, and the people were suffering a lot. They were being persecuted. They were being ostracized. They were being castigated. They were being enslaved, and they were being put to the side. And this man came out and said, we've got to do something about that. And I refer to an old book, if you don't mind, in an old book in the Bible called Esther. This very powerful lady, and she had an uncle named Mordecai. And Mordecai was telling Esther, Esther, we are being persecuted here by the powers that be. And all of us at one time or another, whatever cultural background, we've been persecuted by something larger than us, whether it's an economic, educational, or political system. Mordecai simply said, Esther, you've got to make a difference. But Esther had been moved up to the king's castle. She went to school and got a PhD and forgot her people. She moved up there and thought that she was living well. And every now and then somebody's got to let us know that you didn't always sit where you're sitting today. We've all come through something. We've all had some mountains to climb and some valleys to go through. We've all been poor. We've all had days when the water wasn't clear in our own backyards. I'm the oldest of 8, and we didn't have an indoor toilet until I was 11 years old. All of us have been through something. But how do we take what we've been through, incorporate that, and say, now how do I make the world just a little bit better? How do I find something to lift somebody along the way? So he told him very easily, Mordecai said, Esther, you've got to go and speak to the king and tell him what we're going to do. And Esther looked at him and said, well, I'd like to do that, but it's against the law. But every now and then, as Martin used to teach us, if it's a bad law, break it. If it's a bad law, challenge it. If it's a bad administration, vote it out. Every now and then, we've got to make a stance on something. And Esther said, but if I perish, let me perish. But I've got to say. So she told them, you all go on off and fast and pray. Go to a conference and get all the facts together. I'm going to go. But I like what the uncle said to her. He said this, Esther, maybe you were sitting there with the king. Maybe you will watch this. Maybe you will call for such a time as this. What I want to say to those of you who've come to this august body, that each one of you have been called for such a time as this. Each of us has a different calling for a different time, for a different reason, possibly for the same purpose. What good is it for a boxer to train all year and never get in the ring for a championship fight? This is our time now. We have been called, as Mordecai said to Esther, we have been called for such a time as this. We can abdicate that responsibility, we can rationalize that particular responsibility, or we can do something with it. I'll never forget, when I left Denver, Colorado, my goal in life was simply to become a professional basketball player. And each one of you who I'm speaking to today, you had something in your life that you wanted to do, but every now and then something comes into your life and it changes it. Somebody says something, a car accident, a child that walks away, something happens that changes your thinking. The Admiral said that he saw something on a ship. All of us, there is something that happens in our lives. I had no idea the last thought on my mind in 1959 and 60, 59 years ago, that I would be doing what I'm doing now. My goal in life was very simple: to leave Denver, Colorado, go play basketball, become a professional basketball player, and buy me a brand new Pontiac. My goals were high. My goals were lofty, but there's always something. It might be this conference. Don't just come here to articulate more data, but take that data and make it live, because you've been called for such a time as this. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? I'm riding a bus going to Denver, Colorado, going to Nashville, Tennessee. John and I get there. I cross the Tennessee line, and the bus driver comes up to me and said, "Hey, come here. You got to sit behind this line. You're a Negro. You got to sit behind this line, because it's against the law for you to ride in the front of this bus." And I looked at him, and two black ladies said, "Come on, young man, don't argue with them. They might hang you." And I said, "What? They might?" I said, "How can they hang me? I'm all city basketball. I'm all state basketball. I'm the double D. The double defensive, delectable, darling, dynamic, dangerous, devastating D from Denver. That's who I was." But we can think we're something somewhere, but there's always a mitigating force that will tear you down, challenge your capacity to think. All the movement, people in the climate and environmental movement, we wonder, why doesn't it catch on? Why don't people understand what we're talking about? All the data, with all of the data and all that's been presented, why isn't it at the top of the list? Why is it Pruitt can come in and just wipe something out that Obama and others have put in that we've all worked on? Where is the tenacity? I don't feel any way tired right now. I am more excited now than I've ever been, because the challenge is even higher, because we've been called for such a time as this. When that man told me to get to the back of the bus, and I got to the Greyhound bus station, and I got ready to drink water, and he grabbed my neck and said, "Don't you drink out of that water. That's for white people. This is for colored people." And it was dirty water. It was filthy. The only thing filthier than the water was his attitude. And at times like that, you're pushed to the point where you either bless somebody or you blast them. We're at a point now with the environmental movement. Do we bless or do we blast? Where do we stand? We've been called for such a time as this. You know all the statistics. I had no idea. You might not know really what God has in your store for you to do. You've got it all together. You'll be at another conference next week and 3 weeks from now. It's nothing worse than when you leave a conference and you ask, "When's the next conference?" I got people who are listed up. "I'll be in Las Vegas in January. I'll be on." What do you do when you leave? That's the significance. You have been called for such a time as this. We all have different roles. My role is completely different than yours. You can never do what I do. I can never do what you do. But the difference in the civil rights movement that made us strong, 2 words made us strong, and nobody wants to do it today: sacrifice and risk. Who is willing to sacrifice anything? If I call a meeting and somebody tells me they have a sorority meeting, I tell them to get out. What is the priority in your life, in your mission, with your purpose? I had no idea. When I came there to Nashville, going to play ball, stay for a couple of days, and I'm sitting in a meeting, and I went down there to Fisk University in Nashville, and I'm just looking. And I went down there because I heard there was going to be a meeting that evening. You never know when you go to a meeting or a conference like this how something might be said that might change your life forever. And I was sitting there at Fisk University because I heard they had some of the most beautiful, intelligent women there at Fisk. And I went down to look at the intelligence with my roommate, and the back door opened and 5 men walked in. Sometimes you'll never know what's going to change your life unless you're open, unless you're sensitive. And 5 men walked in. One was John Lewis. The other was Julian Bond. The other was Hosea Williams and Andy Young. And who was this other guy? Martin Luther King. I'm 18 years old. And they walk in, they said, we're going to talk about equity. We're going to talk about equality. We're going to talk about justice. We're going to talk about fairness. We're going to talk about voting rights, human rights, transportation rights. That's overwhelming, like the environmental movement is overwhelming to all of us. But if not you, then who? If not now, then when? We've been called for such a time as this. It starts in the changes in your minds and in your hearts today. And when we started talking, and when we went to the Greyhound bus station that first time, and then the Trailways bus station, and going to jail over 20 times, and all of the nastiness. And for me to walk into a building coming from Denver, Colorado, and see somebody spitting in my face, and I was not nonviolent. And I wondered, how could somebody come to that point? We've got to ask the question with all that's going on, the rising oceans, sharks that do not know which way to swim, salmon that doesn't swim upstream, all of the fracking that's going on, all of the alternative methods that we talk about, solar and wind. We know them, we see them, we hear them, we have it set in stone. But then sometimes something will happen to say, what do I do with it? What good is it to take a class from Dr. Burke and you walk out and say, he was my professor? What did you do with it? What did you do with the information? And that was a challenge for me. I said, I don't care anything about people to be in the vote. I'm going to get out of here and go play basketball and make me some money. And a lot of the people that we're talking about, they're concerned more about mortgages and rents, taking care of their children, than somebody talking about did the polar bear make it to the next glacier. We talk all that, and we get excited inside. There's nothing worse than a whole group of, excuse my French, Christians talking about, oh, how good Jesus is, and they're hellions when they leave church. Just talking among ourselves. Those of us in this room now, it's tough even for me when I reach out to my colleagues and say, look here, there's something about creation care, something in Genesis 1:26 that said, God, take care of my planet. But we're so busy talking about the second book of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not fornicate. How can you get to the second book if you pass the first book? And the first book was take care of what I've given you. I've given you a perfectly balanced ecological world where there's plenty of water, where there's fresh air, where there's clean air. But we're so busy on something else that we're missing the first commandment. When we look at all the statistics that are before us, we have to ask the question, what do I do with it now? How do I make a difference? And I think that that's the question when I begin to ask the question, why does this man hate me? What did I ever do? Why are the segregation laws? And these were laws. And then you come to a point, as we must come to a point in the environmental movement, where we begin to take a stance about the atrocities that are being promulgated out of Washington, the deregulations that are beginning to occur that we fought so hard. I traveled with Barack in 2007 when we were going from here to there, talking about stay in there, we're going to make a difference. I met with the Sierra Club and I was out of water. Mine was not to talk about this. Mine was to talk about how do you save somebody's soul? How do you get them to heaven? But how in the hell can they get to heaven if they're dying here on earth? Because of something that we created, because of our own greed. How do we put profits over people? And when you look at profits over people, we've got to begin to ask the bigger question. This is a moral question, and I call it a civil rights question of today. Civil rights, everybody deserves the right to clean air, toxic-free water. We're suing 3 states right now because of arsenic in the water that's coming from the air. When we're in North Carolina and the hog farmers are putting all those open fields and the water is being putrefied. I'm on the Riverkeepers board with Bobby Kennedy, and we go in there. We went to Raleigh, North Carolina. We make a difference. How do you make a difference? First of all, recognize that this is not an overwhelming situation that we're in. It might feel that way. I remember once, Fred, I was 19 years old, and I was standing out in front of a grocery store in Nashville, And a man came up to me and said, come here, dummy. You'll never vote in this country. Why don't you get back up there to Tennessee State and play basketball? Now, I could have gone on back, played basketball, but I said, how does this man know I'll never vote? There have been those that said the climate movement, the environmental movement will never take the force that it has got to take. It's here now. Otherwise, we're just talking in the wind. So I'm saying that how do we make a difference? What are the solutions? If we've got the answers, we didn't have all of the answers during the civil rights movement. Maybe we didn't even ask the right question, but we knew what injustice was. We knew what was wrong. We knew that we could not be a constitutional part of America and not have constitutional rights. We have a right, our children have a right, and our grandchildren have a right to clean air and clean water. We have all that right. So therefore, how do we do it? First, we talked with the business people because it's about a capitalist move. It's about how much money can be made. And the Admiral talked about it. Where is the money? Where is the money? And it's interesting in America, the people that are disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change are those who pollute the least. So why should a mother with 3 children in an inner city area or a mother who's out in the rural be concerned about what we're talking about when they're dealing with day-to-day issues? We've got to connect the dots to understand that they will not be able to stand up and speak to business people because business people will control the politicians. So when we come together with all the brilliance in this room and all the strength in this room, then we come together. How do the business people come together? When the politicians come together? When the scientists come together? When the Clean Energy Act came together, we were all excited. I was in Paris. I was in Rome when the Lausanne Sea came out. And I looked at it and I wonder, how do we translate that to the everyday person? How do we get a movement going? We've got a good discussion going right now. But the 3 words that kept the movement going, we organized, we strategized, and we mobilized. If you don't organize, if we don't organize, if we don't strategize and mobilize, we've got a good discussion. We'll have another discussion in Las Vegas, another discussion in another part of America. What good is it to have a great strategy and you have no organization? What good is it to have an organization and no strategy? What good is it to have an organization, a strategy, and you're not mobilizing? Iron sharpening iron, and that's when Mordecai told Esther, you have been called for such a time as this. And I looked at that and I said, this is our time. For me, it's complex because the young ministers and young social workers and young environmentalists that I talk to and about, I tell them this is our time. I know it's difficult. I know it's a survivalistic mode of people that you talk with, but you are supposed to be the articulator of the virtues of a faith-based moral decision-making structure. And if you don't do it, as Mordecai told her, then others will do it. Christ said the rocks will cry out. I'm ready for the rocks to start crying out because a lot of people are not crying out. We're crying in. And I believe we need to understand as we did. Now we're at the point of speaking in, preaching in, standing up, praising out, and if necessary, dying in. It's the ends that will get us there. Durley, you're getting very emotional. Yes, I'm emotional. I'm supposed to be emotional because I'm seeing a cycle that's going around again. No difference than when I got on that bus in 1960 and now the kinds of things that I see in breaking news. After every commercial, breaking news. Breaking news in my day was once a month. Now it's after every commercial and I never know what to expect. So therefore, how do we do? How many of us, and I know in this room, I'm preaching oddly enough to the choir. That's what's so sad. So sad. This room should be packed. Trinity and all should be packed. But it's always the pure in heart. It's always those that are right there. And those in the listening audience, you know what we're talking about because you are a part of what we've got to do now. How do we write in our legislators? I'm so proud of the Park Lane students because they said enough is enough. Enough is enough. And when enough is enough, then you do something. And so now we look at it. So now, writing the legislators, going to marching, and even now, even into civil disobedience. Oh, we can't civil disobedience. I might lose my job. Sacrifice and risk. This is our time now. I wish I had on my paper to get up today to give all of the statistics and but I've heard it myself again today. How did I get into the movement? How did you get into the movement? I've talked to some students here today and talked to others, and they said, well, something happened. It's always something that changes you. In my case, there was a lady that came to Georgia and she wanted to fight for teenage pregnancy rights for young ladies. And a group of far right-wing evangelical white preachers in Georgia condemned this lady. And she said, we got to stay in there. And I went with her to a meeting, and I saw the way that these people really castigated this lady. And then I began to realize what keeps people locked up, or I should say constipated with good knowledge. And that is fear, ignorance, greed, and displaced hate. And all of those elements came at this lady at one time, and I said, as many people do, that's not my fight. And then I heard it. But then I felt I was called for a time like this. And I got up, and the 35 of them in the room, and I started with the first one all the way around the room. And when we went to the car, she said, thanks a lot, that made sense. And I said, I don't know what I said. Her name was Jane Fonda. Her husband was Ted Turner. Ted said, I liked it. So then next thing I know, I'm sitting in Iceland. I said, who cares about all of this? This is out of my sphere of influence, but it's all connected. Whatever your background, whether you're a student, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're gay, whether you're lesbian, whether you're female, this is all connected now. The scientists have given us the information. We understand why it's being, the treaty there in Germany, the Paris talks, the clean energy, now beginning to drill on in the waters again. When I traveled I was traveling with a good friend of mine named Jim Wallace, who's with Sojourners, Sally Beam, we were all out down in Katrina. We saw the devastation. I sat there for an hour and I listened to all the devastation. I started to leave. I was just overwhelmed. But then I began to realize that those of us in the room, there are no accidents for what was said, why it was said, who said it, and what it will mean. What will I do? Who will I touch? Who will I grab? What will I take this information today? As the Admiral was speaking, I said, it's nothing else that I could say. I can come up and give the benediction and we could all leave. But then I got up and I began to look at those of you in front of me, and I began to realize that if you don't do it, if I don't do it, if we don't speak, then it won't be spoken. Because the industrialists are moving far beyond us, and they're not just denying it on facts, because the facts are very apparent. When I look at the nor'easter winds, when I look at all of the things that are going on, where it should be cold but it's warm, the scientists have given me everything. I don't need another 5-page research document. I don't need to read another book. I don't need to go to another scholarly journal, because I see, hear, and smell what we're doing to the planet. And once I do that, then something's got to click down inside of each one of us, a thought that will say, I will make a difference. Friend, I didn't stop by here today to scream fire in the auditorium, because what I'm saying, all of you know, this is not an overwhelming challenge. This is another opportunity. That's what crisis means in Japanese. We've got to talk to the business people, the politicians, the scientists, the educators, the conservationists, and do a concerted effort. I think where our movement has begun to fail is that we have not adequately connected the dots with the people that need to be connected to us. If we could begin to connect the dots where people see the relevancy of what we are talking about, and I'm saying we because I'm a part of you in this whole effort, and they begin to see, and then they say, what do I need to do? Right now, they come, and I've invited so many to different meetings, and they say, well, that's fine for you all, but you don't know what I face. And most of us have already faced what they faced sometime or another in our lives. We didn't all come here fairly well off. And I began to understand that. So now it's a charge that we all have at a time such as this to bring people together, because this is a people movement fueled by the necessity of what's being done to us by the people that create these climatic conditions. God gave us something that is so perfect. Now he's sitting back wondering, what are we going to do? And I believe, as Mordecai said, we've been called for such a time this. When I led the protests against the nuclear plants there in Augusta, Georgia, I saw how the insidiousness of a powerful power can be. We're out there protesting because of people's children were dying in the water, and the water was putrid. And the power companies were saying, well, at least we gave them some jobs to work. And the people were glad to have jobs. They didn't realize that the jobs that they were doing out picking up paper and this was not doing anything as far as stopping the proliferation of the poor water that was being done at the building of the nuclear plant. Sacrifice and risk. When you leave this place, what are you going to sacrifice? What are you going to risk? What are you going to say? What are you going to stand for? As Dr. King says, that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And we're all in this together. It's one thing I've learned about the climate movement. It is an equal opportunity to destroyer. It destroys all of us equally, whether you live in a mansion or whether you live in a shack. And therefore, when we begin to come together, but remember this, whenever we come together, that's frightening, because we challenge the powers that be. And the powers that be could go easily to solar or go easily to wind, but they've got to see that there's a capitalist gain in this. What do you mean the sun comes from God and it's free? If you can show me how I can turn $1, we will go to solar tomorrow. We will not have any more coal-burning plants. We'll not have any more piles of coal ash. Oh, we know the words and we say them, but now we've got to understand, how do we get the business people to understand that, and the people on large, that there are jobs in the solar industry. I'm going to 10 historically black colleges and universities to talk to college students about the jobs that are available in terms of environmental engineering, and I tell them, don't come up to me saying you want to get in there and put solar panels on a roof. Don't tell me that. I want you to own the company what makes the solar panels. Understand that and begin to put that together. Put the economics and put the health, put the political will, and it comes from people just like you in this room. If not you, then who? This is what it's about, what we've got to do. And I know I can't deny global warming. My son, and I'm so glad to meet the Admiral, my son is graduating from the Naval Academy next month. And he talks to me about it. And I'm seeing these young people, and I think some of us who are not so young, we need to look at the excitement of the young people, those that are volunteering here at this conference. I've listened to them, what they're talking about, what they want to do. We don't have the all-in-all answer. So I'm saying as to take all that we've learned, all that we've heard, bring it together and begin to connect the dots. That's why I call this a moral journey, a civil rights issue, being willing to organize and strategize and mobilize. I'm willing now to, how do I join forces? We didn't have that before. Young people have got social media where they can call together a march in 3 or 4 months, and 3 or 4 weeks. It would take us months to do the same thing. Those of us who've been out in the field, we've got to get behind the young people, encourage the young people, give them the insights and the knowledge. Here's what Pope Francis said: nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are a part of nature, included in it, and thus it constrains interaction within it. He further says, a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow beings. This is a conference of solutions. What Pope Francis did for those of us in other denominations and other faiths, he gave us the ability to join in with forces regardless of our differences and begin to talk about the equal opportunity, chances and opportunities for this. So now how do we do it? Educate the masses. And I'm convinced now we've got to speak straight talk without chaser. To say, sister, your children are dying, and the reason that they're dying is this. Cancer has never been so pervasive in our society as before. Pointing out the reality, not from a frightening point of view, but from an enlightening point of view, because enlightened masses start to form an awareness. And an awareness starts a movement, and a movement is only fueled by those that believe in it. Our message has to be so solid that the belief system, and that can only come from a God that sits high, that looks low, that holds you in the palm of his hand. But it's interesting that I find that when you get in and you start talking about faith, they say, oh, okay, faith. Give us facts, not faith. But it's interesting, even when Voltaire died on the top of his bed, he said, now I was an atheist all my life, but I know that there's something greater than me. When we get to the point that we realize that upon all that we talk about, there was a faith principle. And I think I was so glad to see the Admiral end with all of the beautiful points that were made. And at the end of Joe Cook's presentation today, all of the scriptural references, whether they're in the Bhagavad Gita or whether they're in the Torah, it all comes back to there is a God that sits high, that knows something, that created all of this for us, and we're simply caretakers of his creation. When we get to that point, then we can speak boldly, we can speak truth to power, and we know that we will make a difference because there's power in the people. There's power in a belief that is greater than us. There's power when we not only have the facts, but we take the facts and pull it together with the business and pull it together with the politicians and put it on a faith foundation and are willing to stand boldly. I'm not here to motivate. I remember somebody told me, you're a motivational speaker. I'm not a motivational speaker. I tried for years to motivate my son to pull his pants up. No. But you can be inspired. Means something breathed into you. Whatever you've learned today, breathe it into somebody else because we're all hurting. We all see this. We all hear things around us. But what good is it to keep it inside? I remember the story they said, you see that old man over there? He's got a lot of good in him. And somebody said, why? He said, because we've never seen any of it come out. Every now and then they've got to see something come out of us. Something that we're saying, and they don't have to hear it all the time. They need to see it. When it comes to the waste we talked about, when it comes to recycling, I started in the old days with changing light bulbs, and everybody laughed at me. And now it's fine because we've gone to fluorescent bulbs. But at that time, so it's a constant process. So I say tonight, this afternoon, after Mordecai had said all he did, and Esther, the key was this. Here's what she said. And I don't leave anything that I haven't, a place where I haven't learned. Esther looked at him and said, if I perish, let me perish. But I'm going to see the king. You know all of the facts. You know how to organize. You know how to strategize. You know how to mobilize. You know how to fight for what we believe in. This is our time. And when it's our time, I'm convinced now I'm not in retirement anymore. I'm in rewirement. I am rewired to go, and I will not bow down. I will not break. I will not bend. I will not back up. But I will stand forces with those who are willing to stand up and say that this is our time to take all the information that we've known and make a difference. That's what we've been called to do. And remember this, it all starts with thoughts. It all starts with our mind. It is said that, and I guess I would think about a personal action plan as we leave this place. Keep your thoughts positive, because every day so many negative forces will come in to destroy your thoughts. Because if you keep your thoughts positive, your thoughts become your words. What comes out of your mouth is what you've been thinking about. So keep your words positive, because your words become your actions. Keep your actions positive, because your actions become your habits. Keep your habits positive, because your habits become your values. Keep your values positive, because your values will become your destiny. And our destiny is to make a difference with the planet that God has given us. Thank you very much. Don't back up. Don't bend. Stay strong. We are in this together. We've been called for such a time as what? Yeah. I didn't hear you. Yeah. I didn't hear you. Yeah. We got to get loud, y'all. Oh, yeah.
Can you stay for questions?
Oh, yeah, sure. Deacons here this morning, and everybody in the congregation heard it.
We need to share the louder. Okay. Oh, we can use the table mics, right?
You want to use the table mics or want us to sit?
Why don't you sit down there? That way, yeah.
Here, Rep.
Right down. Not too bad. Let's let me pull the table up a little bit. There we go.
There it is.
Thank you for your patience. Are there questions? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yes, so many times we come to really wonderful presentations like this, and I think I just must know thousands of people who would have benefited from being at this presentation, yet so much I feel also that while this being in community helps intellectually, where my real motivation comes from, my spiritual commitment to sustainability, is at 11 p.m. every night when I'm sitting in my chair in my yard with my dogs next to me and I'm looking up at the trees. And every night I get to that point where I just say, thank you, God, for these trees. And that's really where my motivation comes from. When I leave my yard in the morning to come to events like this, I look at this and I think what I'm leaving behind, I think, you know, maybe my deepest motivation would be just from spending this whole day in my garden, not from going to another conference. It's a real conflict to me about feeling like we keep having more and more meetings in San Antonio, in a city that has so many meetings. How can we really be productive and not just make people more busy? Thank you.
Well, I was going to say, thank the trees, but get up and help somebody else to reach the point where they can appreciate the trees. If we all kind of got motivated in our own areas and did not come back out, I mean, our being here today, we've had to go through a lot, and we wanted to push it. My own children, my own students, when I was a dean of the school. So it's so easy to become isolated and be, I guess, motivated in yourself, but to reach out. And a lot of times you don't have to say anything. I've battled with so many young African-American males who've given up and starting to wear their pants hanging down and they're this and don't care. But I have to be out there to continue, even in the midst of my own frustration, to show that you can make a difference. And the mere fact that you get filled, pass it on.
I often get the same kind of question, how do I get involved? Because I really don't see that same urgency. And unfortunately for many of us, again, I think it's the fact that you have a tree. And that you're not affected in the same fashion as so many who are affected by our prosperity and opportunity. And you talk about equality. Again, in the 30 million, there's a segment at the very end in which a small boy is about 7 to 9 years old, says that he doesn't understand why he is the victim of our prosperity. Because we have a tree to look at, admire, and thank, but we are not taking into effect the fact that inaction eventually will destroy the tree that you bless. And if you want to take an example, go to northern Alaska and see the true impact of climate change in that portion of the world that those trees no longer exist. Villages are being displaced by the tens of thousands of yards because of the loss of the tundra in which they go. When I was the regional commander of the Pacific Northwest, I was always blessed by the ability to visit those places. But when an Inuit chieftain came to me and said, can the government provide me an LCAC, the landing craft? Because our tribe is unable to move from its location to its traditional hunting grounds because the tundra is impassable. It's swamp. And normally they would just go by the regular trail. Those individuals would love to experience what you're experiencing, but we now have, as the pastor said, we have the need to come together and realize that by just sitting in our backyard and looking at our tree, we are not taking the action that's necessary for that equal opportunity to exist across the globe. So hopefully you'll attend the next conference, and then you'll go home and admire your tree, because you're luckily enough it's still there.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you both. This was like a left brain, right brain presentation. Each one of yours, kind of hit a different part of what what make, the equation that it's going to take to change the world. What challenges me is, so at the local level, I feel like, yeah, we got this. Give me 10 years, I can flip this city or whatever. This change is going to happen. The numbers favor it, economics favor it, everything like that. But then when I'm hearing about Bangladesh, I'm getting a knife deep in my heart. And I'm sitting there going, there was that comment about in Japanese, the word crisis means opportunity. And I'm a big believer in saying, yeah, hey, if it's a big, obvious lemon, I'm going to make some big, obvious lemonade. Let's do something. But I'm sitting here going, wow, Bangladesh. And I'm looking at other countries, Sao Paulo, et cetera. And I'm going, how the heck and how can I contribute to the solutions that need to occur at that scale in those developing countries where they are, making some of the same mistakes we made early on? What role can I play? I'm looking to help you guys make some lemonade.
Well, I had to make a decision, and I had to pick my battle and pick what I could do with my limited resources in terms of my ability to move. And I had to do this when I worked with gangs, and I coined a phrase called SOS, save only some, because I had spread myself so thin I was being ineffective. I was trying over here, over there. And I think that if one has an international flair for Bangladesh or whatever it is, I think that they need to go all out. Mine right now is to try to take some of the impoverished areas in the rural parts of Georgia and America, and particularly in the African American community, and some of those that the young men and women that can articulate these kinds of concerns, talk to them about health conditions, talk to them about asthma, talk to them about what they can do when we go down to the state capitol, those kinds of things. And so I sense a certain feeling about what the Admiral was talking about Bangladesh, but it would be overwhelming for me to try to move that. So I had to pick where I would be, what I would do for the few minutes that I have left on the planet. So that's how I do it. Otherwise it becomes unimaginable and unmanageable.
And I respect, as the Reverend articulates, there's only so much you can do. But I think that where I'm coming from is that far too often the conversation is too isolated. And the necessity to bring together the individuals who can potentially solve some of the larger problems is not part of that conversation. There are, as I said, if I had the keys to the castle, I would create a global Manhattan project predicated solely on the storage element. Battery technology has not changed in 60 years. We've just found different elements that contain and hold onto an electron longer and provide opportunity. That's not the solution for tomorrow, especially since the two most significant components today are a limited resource, and we don't have the ability to expand that capacity into a global environment. So I think what we really need to do is to recognize that, one, as the world expands and we look to what's happening, if we don't solve, if we, and I'm saying the collective we, in the bigger sense, don't help to solve some of the large-scale Bangladesh problems, for example, the world issues on health and food and water and the likes. The technology's there. The issue is, how do we come together as a community? And I'm talking, how do we come together as a community so that those solutions are not predicated on a capital return? Because that's what it's all about.
That's right.
It's all about a capital return. It isn't about whether or not the community is being served best by the implementation or the direction of where mankind takes the next step. It's how much money can I make as a result. And you said, turn it into a capital. You could turn it into whatever. And I'm telling you that, I was the president of the Center for Sustainable Energy in California. And if you think that you can turn your community around in the matter of a few years, you have not begun to fight with the utility. You have not begun to fight with the stockholder that owns 90% of America's utilities, whether it be water, energy, waste, or anything else, because that's where the transgression, as a matter of fact, I contend that the movement to a more sustainable future lies best in the undeveloped world, because there is no capital venture that you must overwhelm. You can go into the islands of the Bahamas and create an entire new system. You can go into India where 30 million people have no access and have never had access to electricity, and as you saw in the film, create a light. It's the first light they've ever seen in their life. But it wasn't done by a utility company, it was done by a solar panel. That opportunity creates that possibility, but it can't be attached in the same fashion that we look at solving every other problem. We together have to come together as a different community to solve the world's problems, and they need to be done in place, because the refugee problem will only get worse, and the conflict associated with refugee problems is a destabilizing geopolitical environment in a nation state that will be overwhelmed by the refugee itself.
Is there one more question? One more question for the, go ahead, Andrew. Make sure you turn the mic on. Try the other mic.
Hello?
Yes, much better.
Going off the last question, do you believe that the international religious community, like Christian or otherwise, could be the vessel to which you go across international borders to solve this like world problem of climate change? It's like, I know the Pope has gone in on that, but do you believe it's happening right now, or do we need to like work on that?
That's an easy answer, yes. Because everyone has a belief system. We're doing a lot of work with, we're in India with Sri Sri Ravi Shankar with the art of living and what they're doing, and in other parts of the Muslim community and the Jewish community. I have a whole litany of interfaith kinds of actions, and it all comes back to a creative force. And so I think the foundation, as I said earlier, the foundation is upon that belief. But we've got to exercise. What good is it for me to believe that brakes will stop my car if I never put my foot on the brake? We've got a lot of people believing in all that we've talked about, but they don't do anything. So consequently, I think when people can have this word called faith, believing in something greater than me that will sustain me when all opposition comes toward me, it's that faith element, and that transcends Christian and Muslim. It's a force, and particularly in areas that we haven't even labeled as religion, the spiritual world. And I believe that that's where the real strength of this movement. That was the strength of us in the civil rights movement. We did all of the marching, but we never left without prayer. We didn't know what would be transpiring. And I see years later now, in 13 years, civil rights bill, human rights bill, transportation rights bill, and others. And we're so proud now, even to see when people were saying a few years ago that marching is obsolete. And now look at the young people, they're taking it up. So, but they had a spiritual base. In Washington a few weeks ago, I looked at about 2,000 young people in prayer before they went up to the camp, and I cried. So to answer your question, it will rest a foundation. It is not a solution, but I think it is a foundation, the faith principle. But for some reason, we've moved up in a culture that says, if somebody says that I believe in a God, or I believe in Yahweh, or I believe in El Shaddai, or whoever it is, it's, oh, well, that's a soft, kind of mushy something until they die, or until they have a car accident, or until their family explodes. Then they want to come back and hold on to something that's stable. So I think that the sustainability and the stabilizing rests in one's belief system. And I don't particularly go after which belief system. I respect all faiths and all belief systems, but there's got to be that sustaining force that can talk to a military person. Has a different mentality. He's a different kind of breed here. But military people, they go for victory, regardless of who wins. But how do you win? Business people, they have a bottom line. Politicians, bottom line, I want to win and be reelected. We should be trying to bring all of those points together. And I think when we can take our own egos and put them on the altar and crush it, then we can move ahead.
So, I mean, I agree 100%. and I'm strong in my faith. But I think that the thing that's most exciting for me, and I've done a lot of these, is in your title, it says interfaith. And when I was a senior in high school, I needed a humanities course to graduate. As a science and math major, humanities were the last thing that I wanted to do. But in order for me to get out the front door, I needed a humanities course. So there was this really good-looking instructor. So I took world religions. And while I learned to not like the individual in particular, I loved the course. Because I think what it did for me was to set up a basis by which I could compare my faith with the rest of the world. And what I really found out was that it doesn't make any difference who. They all believe in a higher being. What they call it, as you say, Yahweh and whatever. I mean, Yahweh is Allah. Allah. I mean, they're all the same thing. Strangely enough, Yahweh in Hebrew is Lord, and I found that in the Pacific Northwest Indian language, Yahweh exists as God of nature. Isn't that amazing? Millions of years apart, hundreds of thousands of miles, and the term for what it is that we believe is bigger is in both languages. So I think, again, and why it's important that the communities separate their social differences, because this is not about one culture winning over the other. Because that's what man has been since its creation. We talk about the Crusades and the Crusades for this and that. Crusades had nothing to do with religion. It had everything to do with the purchase and the creation of land space with the start of the Byzantine approach into the Afghanistan steppe. It ended up into the religious issues, so if you want to study the Crusades again as a history nut, it had nothing to do with religion except the Pope in the Second Crusade offered the opportunity for those who were not sanctimonious in the First Crusade to redeem themselves and not be discommunicated. So, the whole thing, we need to separate those, come together as a faith-based species, and fix the problem. Because what happens for us, again, that 7-year-old boy in Bangladesh is wondering why he is the victim of my prosperity. That's what we're dealing with. And there are no borders. And it doesn't make any difference, and again, Pastor, you said, or Reverend, you said anything. It doesn't make any difference if you're in a multi-million-dollar mansion or you're living in a cardboard shack in Bangladesh.
Equal opportunity.
The outcome is identical. And that's the piece that I think from a faith-based perspective, we come together as opposed to pull apart, and we can solve the problem.
And one of the things that I've found, and in particular working with Muslims and Jews and Shiites and Buddhists, and even though I'm in the Christian faith, I find that when I'm with other people of other faith, I get stronger in my own faith because I'm not threatened. We get threatened by somebody else's faith and we become somewhat small and myopic, but when we begin to share the differences, when I'm speaking with rabbis or imams and they're talking about what they're doing, I tend to grow because I can appreciate a difference, and I think that transcends racial lines and gender lines. When you can appreciate what women go through, then you can be a stronger man, I believe. And the same thing happens with your faith. And I think that people in the business world, and you're closer to that than I am, but in the business world, if they can see how they can make a profit and still do good, they will do it. We've got to connect it that they can make a profit, the bottom line, to please the shareholders and still not destroy the planet. I mean, I look now, I was a tough sale because when I was growing up, I grew up poor, and I said, when I get grown, I'm gonna buy me a brand new Cadillac. I wanted everybody to see that I finally made it. And I finally got to get a Cadillac, and they were driving Mercedes then. And I said, wow, and I was trying to keep up with the junk. And then finally, when I said, I can afford a Mercedes, they said, man, why are you driving that gas guzzler? So now I drive a little hybrid. And I'm saying, but again, it's when you can feel comfortable and not let everybody else determine who you are. And this is what the faiths can do across our various faith lines.
I think that's a good note to end on. As I said yesterday, glory to God in the highest and peace to his people and earth. Thank you very much, Reverend Durley and Admiral Herring.